So, welcome. My name is Benjamin Marcoulier. I am involved. My team was originally 2051. Recently, I've been a CSA at different first competitions and off-season events. And that's kind of where I'll be coming with you from all the knowledge that I've learned. That's where a lot of the stuff that I see is what's happening at first competitions. And these are just the tips and tricks that I picked up, how to troubleshoot your stuff on the field, different tools that you might not realize that you have access to help you out during competition. So first, I'm going to go over specifically your driver station, because there's a lot of key stuff here, not just with the driver station app itself, but the laptop as well. Starting with the laptop, it's my personal recommendation that the laptop you use at competition, definitely at competition, should just be used for driver station. It's nice to have a laptop that's only for driver station, but of course I know that's not a viable option for a lot of teams, but definitely at competition, you should probably be using one laptop solely as your driver station. The reason I say that is because on the field, your communication, your ability for your computer to recognize different devices and stuff like that can be severely hindered by what's going on the laptop. Some of the ways to fix that is to always have your laptop plugged in at the field. There's a power port right there. You should always have your laptop plugged in at the field, because some laptops will CPU throttle if they're not getting constant power. Even if they're at full battery, they'll still CPU throttle. So you should always have your laptop plugged in. I was at the Smoky Mountain Regionals with the team. I was having communication issues, and one of the big things that they were running into unknowingly was CPU throttling because they didn't plug in their laptop. One of the other things is what you have running in the background. As most people know, Chrome is a pretty intensive thing to have running in the background. So that can take CPU, as well as any other apps that you might have running. One of the other things that teams don't really look into with resources being taken up in the background are your startup apps. So if you hit Control-Alt-Delete and Task Manager, you can go to Startup and see what starts up the second you turn on your computer that you might not need, because some of these things, once they start up, you don't realize that they're running in the background. So I recommend turning off a good bit of the things that you don't really need, especially at competition, because CPU throttling can be a huge issue, especially when it comes to things like trip time and packet loss. On the topic of communication, one of the other big things is IP addresses. If you're using one thing on your robot, so for example, a Limelight, almost all Limelight's teams set as a static IP. So if you're setting at least one device on your robot, maybe your laptop, your Limelight, your RoboRio, if you set anything as a static IP, you should really set everything as a static IP. Now, how you do that on the laptop side is if you come down here to the Wi-Fi symbol, right click, open network, and hit change adapter options. You'll come to this screen. The two biggest things on this screen are your different type of network connections. So if you have any enabled, of course, right now I have to have Wi-Fi enabled to do this Zoom presentation, but if you're at competition, you would want to go in here, right click and hit disable, and you should disable anything except for an Ethernet, or if you're using USB to Ethernet, the USB to Ethernet adapter. On top of that, with the Ethernet, if you double click on it, go down to Internet Protocol version 4, hit properties. This is where you can go in and set a IP address. When you're setting an IP address for any one of the first products, it is very important that you set each one correctly, because they all have different IP addresses, but they generally follow the same type of layout. So your first number is almost always going to be 10, followed by, and the setup is te.am. So if you have a 4-digit number of your team number, for example, my team when I was a student was 2051. So the TE would be the 20, and the 51 would be the AM. So TE, AM, and then the last number specifically to the laptop would be 0.5. Ooh, I did not click the right cell. I am sorry. 0.5. Down here, your default gateway, or your subnet mask would be 255.0.0.0. And then
I think that you accidentally put 250 and then 5 instead of 25 and
you're right. You're right. Sorry. Thanks, David.
yeah.
And then you can just leave your default gateway empty, and you hit OK and close. And that configures your Ethernet on the laptop. One of the other big things that teams forget to do when going to the field, other than just network adapters, and this is probably the biggest thing that we see going through that leads to communication issues, is your firewall. So if you go in here, type in fire, pops up Windows Defender Firewall and Net Security. You go in here and you'll have 3 different types of firewalls: your domain, your private, and your public. You want all 3 off. Now, of course, if you want to turn this back on after competition, I understand, especially if you use your team laptop for other things. But when you are at competition, make sure these are always off, and check it quite frequently. If you want, even check it before every match, because sometimes Windows will just turn it back on, or another teammate might turn it back on, something like that. But you really want to check these often, because this is one of our biggest issues with being connected. If they are on, what you would do is hit Windows Defender Firewall Properties, and then you just go through domain off, you click private, you put it on off, and public, you put it on off. Okay, and that is that. That's a good bit of the stuff when it comes to the laptop itself. Does anyone have any questions? Perfect. We will move on to the driver station app. Little things in here. Last time I was using this, I was using it for testing purposes, so I set it to 0. But of course, as always, you should have it set as your team number. But one of the things that a lot of people don't know about the driver station is that it has a log file. Every single time you connect to your robot, it collects logs of everything your robot did, the communications between your robot and laptop, all that fun stuff. And it is very, very, very useful when it comes to troubleshooting. So if you click on the little settings symbol and hit view log file, this screen will pop up. Now, there's a lot going on this screen, so let's break it down. This is your log file viewer. On the left here, you'll have every match that you connected to. This is going all the way back to Greater Pittsburgh Regional that I'm in right now for the team. So that's what this is here. And you can go through and click every time you connect it. When you connect to the field for an actual match, you'll notice that it sets, hey, this is practice match 14, 24, 31. But anytime you can connect in between that, it just sets the date and the time. And you can see all your connections. Down here is the log directory. This just shows you where the file is stored. And then right below that is the details. So when you have something from the log file selector, it just shows you the general main points of the log file. But if you actually go on to your viewer, which is the big black box in the center, it will show you specifics about anything that you're hovering over with the mouse. If you look at my mouse, when it goes over the big black box in the center, you'll notice that it changes into a magnifier. You can use this to zoom in on a specific portion of the logs. Very often, if you're looking at something that went wrong in a match, you'll see up here, it starts with gray. This is their disabled section. So this is when you're waiting for the match to start. For example, when they're going through and doing the introductions of every team and waving the flag. That's what this is here. And most of the times you don't really need to look at this. What you want to look at is your auto, which is the screen section. So whenever your robot is in autonomous mode, it's this little green section here. And when your robot is in teleop, it's this big blue section here. So if we use our magnifier, we click down, hold it down and drag over from the start of the green to the end of the blue, we specifically select out just the match section when we were active. Going on in here is a lot of data points. So over on the side, you'll notice a color code. Your latency is going to be your green here. Your packet loss, also in orange, is going to be the orange bar down here. Red is your RoboRio CPU, followed by the red line. And then this CAN percent is this big chunk of light in the middle here. Going up top, we have a little bit more color coding. So disabled, like I said, is that gray section. Auto is the green section, and blue is the teleop section. And that's how you can tell what state your robot was in. You can also see the connect and the disable are two big sections. So this orange bar right here at the very end, that's when your robot got disabled. You lost communication, it was the end of the match, it got disabled, and you have radio data and stuff here. Going back to the side, we see battery voltage off by itself. That is in yellow, and that is this line here. So if I hover it over it with my mouth, with my pointer, you'll notice in the bottom details tab, it's showing me at that exact time, my voltage was 12.2. Or I can go over here and see that my voltage dipped down to 9.1. And over here, it dipped down really low as 7.2. If you'll go above that, you'll notice that matching up with those dips are error symbols up here. So a very good way to look at, hey, is something going on with my robot? For example, you might notice a jerky motion on the field, which could be a few things, but one of the things it definitely could be is browning out, which are these big power dips here. Brownouts are whenever your robot could be using a lot of power, it could be short circuiting, but it's getting very close to a blackout, which is the loss of power. Brownouts are those dips really close to blackouts. And that's your main data on this screen. Now, if you're looking for a very specific thing, all this data in your face can be quite a lot. So you can go over here to the groups and plots, and you can turn off specific things. So if I don't really care what state my robot was in, I want to see what it was constant throughout the whole match, I can turn off robot mode. I can turn off all the basic stuff. And if I'm just looking at my latency and my connection, so this is how long stuff is taking to talk to. This is how many packets I'm dropping, stuff like that. Or I can turn off my comms and I can just look at battery voltage, RoboRio CPU, stuff like that. Anyone have questions on this screen? Because I know there's a lot going on here.
Hi, Ben. It's Mark. Just confirming the scales we're looking at here. Battery voltage has its own yellow scale from 0 to 16, but the rest of the graphs are plotted on this 0 to 120 scale.
Yes. So the CAN you'll see here, this is all on that 0 to 120 scale. The battery voltage is also on that, is on the 0 to 16 scale, sorry, not also. And accordingly with robot CPU, you can see that 85 here lines up with that 85 there. So yes, everything else is on this one, while battery voltage has its own dedicated little scale.
Cool.
Go
ahead.
To kind of add on to that, a weird quirk about this is that packet loss percentage is actually not the correct label. It's actually just amount of lost packets, and it can go above 100%.
Yes. Packet loss, it just says lost packets. Sorry, thank you.
Excellent. And the other question I had was, so if I'm reading this graph correctly, CAN bus appears to be hovering between 55 and 95% utilization. Is that normal, or is this robot risking dropping CAN packets? What do we usually see?
The CAN utilization reporting in driver station this year, the window filter that they used wasn't set up properly, and I think that there were incorrect weights on some of the frames compared to others. So long story short is that all of this is kind of useless, and you just kind of have to average it with your eyes. I have some examples of like log files from earlier years where you can see that it's just like a straight line because it's being reported correctly. If anyone wants to take a look at that, but yeah, no, that's just something new to this year, and hopefully they'll fix it next year.
So that's with the CAN specifically. And David, thank you for that, because David did a really long talk with some people and actually taught me a good bit when it comes to CAN on the driver station. So I thank you for that. Are there any other questions when it comes to this screen here? Cool. So if you go over to the event list, so we were in the data and events versus times graph. If you go over to the event list, at the bottom of your driver station, you'll have a little screen here that shows you different errors, stuff like that, if everything's running good. That basically is right here in the event list as well. And you can see any error in order of time that they happen during the match. So if you're getting a repeated error that's happening every now and then, and you think it happens, about every 10 seconds, you can come in here and you can see when you got that error. Is it repeated? Is it the exact same error every time? Does it match up with something that we're seeing happening on the field itself? Got a chat. In the chat, David gave a link to some examples if any of you guys want to look at that after. Also, after this, I'll be posting some links in the Discord for the WPI lib docs, as well as driver station logs, best practices when it comes to your driver station, status lights, IP configs. It's basically going to be a lot of the stuff that I talked about here, but in documents that you can reference every single time. One of the most important documents to me that I'll get to is the status lights document. I use it on the field all the time. Basically, every 10 minutes that I'm at the field, there's a document of every device that first has had and all of its status lights, what they all mean. So it's a very good reference. So moving on to actual things that happen on the field. Some of the biggest issues that you have are like your robot turning off. A lot of people, when they see the robot turning off, they'll like freak out. They won't pay attention to the match as much. But if your robot shuts down, there are actually some very important things that you can do to figure out and troubleshoot why it shut down and to prevent the problem in the future. Of course, when your robot shuts down, the first thing you want to do is figure out, hey, what just happened that caused the shutdown? So did you just get hit? Was it by itself in the center of the field? Did you hit a button on your controller and then all of a sudden it shut down to do a task? What led to the shutdown? That's the first thing that you want to make a mental note of in your head, because that can very often tell you the issue or lead directly to the first step in troubleshooting. One of the other things you want to do is start counting. The second you lose comms to your robot, you want to start counting 1, 2, 3. And the reason for this is very often your robot will boot back up, but the amount of time that it takes to boot back up is very telling, because the Robo-Rio and the radio each have two different times generally that they take to boot up. For Robo-Rio reboot, it's about 30 seconds. For a radio reboot, it's about 45 seconds. So if your robot only takes 30 seconds to boot up, even though you lost communication, then you can figure out, hey, it's most likely not a radio issue. The second we get off the field, let's focus in on the Robo-Rio. Or vice versa, if it's a radio, if it takes about 45 seconds, that doesn't narrow it down as much as a Robo-Rio reboot, because if you think about it, once you lose radio, you're going to lose comms to everything. And your Robo-Rio could have been booting as well, and you just wouldn't have known, but it's still a very good thing to count, and it helps you slightly narrow down your luck. So I'm going to show a few examples and logs here. So if you look at here during the auto phase, there was a lot of voltage use. And you can be running a lot of things at once. And what happens typically when you do that is you'll notice very jerky motion. Jerky motions can be a few things, but what you most commonly see is battery usage. So if you start to do multiple tasks at once, like driving and shooting, and you see your robot struggling to move, I would first go into your driver station logs once the match is over and look at your power usage. Because if you're doing multiple things at once and your robot pulling too much power. So when it comes to setting your IP, we showed you how to do that on the driver station, but you're also going to have to do that on everything else on your board. Now, I can't do it right now for the RoboRio because I'm not connected to a RoboRio, but what you would do is you would go in and you would type in 172.22.11.2. You'd hit enter, and you have to be connected via USB tether to do this. And that would bring up, can we hide this? That would bring up this screen. And this is your web dash for your RoboRio. And you can click the Ethernet port button here, and there will be a pop-up to set your RoboRio IP. When you set, like I said, when you set one IP static, you should set all your IP statics. One of the very common issues we saw during the competition season was Limelights randomly just not connecting whenever you started up your robot. It was an issue for a lot of teams. It was really hard to pinpoint what was doing it, but eventually they found out because so many teams have the static Limelight, but they have nothing else static on their driver station or robot, it was just an IP issue. And if you set everything static, magically your Limelight issues disappear. So if you saw that being an issue, that's one of your solutions. Also on here, this is the WPI libdocs. If you don't know what this is, it is an amazing resource. I reference it all the time. It helps you do everything on your robot, start to finish. This is also where I find everything like, where is it? This is where you get your IP configs, your status lights, your best practices, your docs. This is everything that I use on the field. So you should save this website. I highly recommend it. I'm going to send the most important ones, in my opinion, that I use every day at the field. Sorry for the choppiness. I am having weird technical issues right now, which I should be able to troubleshoot because that is my job. Does anyone have any questions so far? While I am trying to figure out why this is not coming up.
Actually, one question about the static IP address assignment. So
yes.
After setting a static IP, do we need to configure anything else to be aware of those static IPs? Does the driver station, for example, know how to find the RoboRio after the RoboRio has had its IP address statically set?
Yes. So when you set everything with a static IP, the first software is very good at finding everything. It's all built for each other. So it will know where to go. I have the IP page, which will go over all of that.
Excellent.
At the end of each one, so like I said, it's all going to follow the same starting layout, 10.te.am. And then the last one is what's specific to each individual part on the robot. So this is what I was talking about. Your example is 10.te.am2. If you have a 3-digit team, you're just going to exclude that 0. If you have a 2-digit team, you do have to put a 0 in there. But otherwise, this is your setup. And this will go over everything that I've said so far. Specific things, if you're using a camera, you have to set within a general range. You have to make sure none of your IPs overlap. Because if they do, you're going to run into issues, but your RoboRio will end at .2. Your radio will and with .1, but that's programmed automatically by the kiosk at the field. So you won't have to mess with your radio. You're just going to be doing your Robo Rio and your driver station. Always do 5 for your driver station here. Going over some of these other documents. This is a very comprehensive, detailed list of everything going over the driver station. I explained a good bit of it, but if you want to reference at any time, anything that's going on here, they have slightly old pictures, but it's all still the same thing. And this goes over all the different points of the driver station. Your driver station is going to be the biggest thing for figuring out what's going on with your robot. And then your status lights. This is the one that I use religiously because I can't remember all these status lights off the top of my head. But if you go here, your status lights on your Robo Rio, it shows everything that's going on for each light, what the different amount of blinkings are, what different colors are. With your radio, same thing, your PDP. The Rev ones, they're still adding in. I know we saw a lot of issues with things like the sticky faults on Rev devices. So when it comes to your new Rev products, do remember those are new. They're still figuring those out. So be careful when it comes to those. But this will show it goes way, way back, all the way to even our Jaguars, which I really hope no team is still using, but you never know. Now going specifically into troubleshooting with the electronics board, I have a very small crude electronics board where I can show you some things, which I will do now. What you have to think about when it's coming to the electronics board is with your issue, where is it specifically located at? Because a lot of the times what people do is they'll start, hey, I'm having a communication issue, and they'll start at the Robo Rio and they'll work their way back all the way to the radio. But if you know it's going to be an issue somewhere between the radio and Robo Rio, you can check the center first, which cuts out half the issues. So, okay, lovely. So I have a very crude board setup here, just to show you the main general things. And this will be more set up if you're at the in-person presentation, because I'll actually have code running to show different examples. So your biggest issues will come with loose wire connections. For example, if you look here, I have a loose wire right here, these popped out right away when I touch them. And that can lead to big issues because if you have any copper showing, you can get a short circuit. With the VRM here, if you get a short circuit touching these, you'll lead to connectivity issues because the VRM on this board is powering your radio. So with connectivity issues, especially leading to bad power connections, you'd be looking at things like every time your robot hits a bump or takes another hit from another robot. That's when you would notice issues like this coming up. So if every time you hit another robot and your robot jerks a little bit or you lose extra packets, you would be looking at something like loose wires. Another very common issue you'll see is Ethernet connection. So if you don't have it clipped all the way in, anytime you hit a bump, it pops out just like that really easily. What a lot of teams do to prevent some connectivity issues, especially when it comes to power, is they'll put both a PoE and a barrel connector in. Because barrel connectors have a tendency to pop out as they're just friction fit, and PoE injectors are a click in. So what a lot of teams do as a protection from that is they'll put both in. Going over here, your radio, your Robo Rio main connection, like I said, if you're only down for 30 seconds, it's not going to be a radio issue. It's most likely going to be a Robo Rio issue. And power lossage, which is stopping communication, you don't have to look at the whole board if you know, for example, your radio is connected, because you know your whole board is getting power. It's only a Robo Rio thing. So you don't have to look at the whole board. You just have to look at the connection here, and your fuse. A lot of people forget this fuse. I have a blown out fuse right here from a previous competition that I worked at. The wrong fuse was put in the slot. It was a different amperage, and that's why it blew up. But the team wasn't looking for that because everyone forgets about the fuse. And they assumed something was wrong later down the line because they couldn't find the issue, but it was only an issue with the Robo Rio. So you know you're pretty likely to have the issue be somewhere right here, as the Robo Rio is very separated power-wise from the rest of your board. One of the other issues is a lot of teams use CAN bus, and CAN bus is a bus system, so everything has to be connected. If one thing pops out, which is very easy if another robot touches you, hits inside your frame perimeter, or you have a loose connection, that pops out, part of your CAN bus chain is no longer connected, which can run into issues. Also make sure at competition that even if you don't use anything in CAN bus, you still connect your Robo Rio to your PDP. It's one of the things that you're supposed to do. One of the other things a lot of people forget about when it comes to competition and issues is a lot of people want to focus just on the electronics, but you really have to think about your issue. If your issue is only coming up when you're running a specific routine and nothing else, then it might be a code issue, which is a lot of people forget. For example, what I saw at competition was a team had a shooter that typically ran auto, but if they forget at one point, they hit manual, they were writing to 2 different locations at the same time, which has caused a jerky motion. Now, the first thing people look for is electrical issue. When they couldn't find that, they kind of were stumped and gave up, but it's only happening not when they got bumped, not a consistent issue, only when they run both of those things at the same time, which is what led to a code issue. Also, looking in the chat here, they made a note about not pushing firmware mid-season updates. That is very correct. Rev does not like to push updates to firmware mid-season unless it's critical, because that can lead issues with teams. First is not always the same. I highly recommend checking first. And one of the big things that you can use to actually check for that is if you go to the CSA.
Just a note, you're not sharing right now, Ben.
What?
You're not screen sharing right now, Ben.
Oh, whoopsie daisies. Thank you. Sure. So if you search the CSA repair tool, typically it's my first pop-up, but we're also not on my Google account, so it's not popping up. I'll have to get the link for that. If it's for me, it typically pops up right away, but it's a GitHub thing. It's called the CSA repair tool. It goes on a flash drive. It was made by another CSA, and it pulls all updated manuals, any updated code, any updated firmwares for everything FRC related. So that's a very nice thing. Every CSA, almost every CSA at competition carries the CSA repair tool. It plugs in, it has driver stations on it, it has the Robo Rio imaging tool, it has a lot of stuff like that. It's a very useful tool, has everything you could possibly need. And it's always updating because it just looks at online libraries and pulls the most recent one to your laptop. So if you have comms, but you're unable to move, your most common things that you should check is your software up to date? Does your computer still recognize your joysticks? Were you recently hit so your CAN or a PWM could be unplugged? And has code gotten stuck in a loop? That's if you have comms, so the lights down here still show green, but your robot's not moving at all. An example with some of these is your software up to date. What we saw last season is some teams using Java, if they didn't have the most up-to-date firmware, they had what was called the joystick connection issue. The computer just forgot your joysticks existed and you couldn't talk to your robot. And even though everything else was working, if your firmware was not all up to date, sometimes your robot would just drop your joysticks. Does your computer still recognize your joysticks? It's very possible that in the heat of things, you accidentally tugged on your controller too hard and a USB disconnected. So like I said, if your robot stops working, don't immediately say, oh heck, we're screwed. Look at your connections. Is this red? Plug back in your joystick. CAN could have gotten unplugged, or a PWM could have gotten unplugged. If it's a PWM though, it's most likely only one thing has stopped working. So like I said, whenever something happens, see, did you take a bump? Are you starting a new process on your robot that you weren't doing before? For example, manual shooting, stuff like that. If your robot's moving around in very jerky motion, check to see how much battery voltage is dropping, check bandwidth usage, check computer CPU usage, and check packet loss. Those are your big notes there. Status light's your best friend. And always ask the CSA questions. I know it's kind of jumpy all over the place. Does anyone have any questions? I'll put a more concise note list of this in the Discord after that pinpoints this better, because I know it was a little jumpy. I was having some computer issues.
Regarding the CAN, so the CAN bus should terminate to the PDB, right?
Yes, it's best practice to terminate to the PDP, and we highly recommend doing it. You technically don't have to, but we highly recommend doing it. If you don't end up using your PDP as your terminating resistor, there is a little jumper, which I can show. There's a little jumper on the PDP right here. If you can see it well, I don't know if I'm giving enough light, but you can take that out and then put it on the off side, and that will turn off that jumper there as your terminating resistor.
Okay, great. What I'm curious about is for verifying CAN bus continuity, is there a way to ask if the RoboRio can see the PDB?
Yes. You can go if you have the so if you have a old PDP, you can use Phoenix Tuner and look at the CAN bus tab. And if your PDP is the last thing in your CAN loop, you should see it show up. If you have the newer Rev PDP, then you can plug into it with USB Type-C, and I think you should be able to see if it like detects a RoboRio on the bus, because of like the heartbeat signal that it generates, I think every 20 milliseconds.
Excellent. I'll have to look at the WPI lib also and see if there's a way to get that heartbeat signal over the CAN bus itself, because if there is, hypothetically, a team can just put a CAN bus continuity light on their dashboard or their smart dash. I haven't tried that before.
Yeah, so the heartbeat is something specific to all FRC CAN devices, where like it's required in the CAN protocol, like specifically laid out by WPI, that all CAN devices have to like disable themselves if they don't receive a heartbeat frame within 100 milliseconds, I think. I might be getting that number wrong. Here, I'll send a link to the site that goes over the CAN device specifications specifically for First Robotics. It's every 20 milliseconds. Yeah. So, if 100 milliseconds has passed since this packet was received, the robot program can be considered hung, and devices should act as if the robot has been disabled. So, I am not entirely sure what the best way to go about, like, logging that automatically is. I'm sure you could find some way of doing it, but yeah.
Excellent.
Any other questions, comments, concerns? If you want, I do have a few like examples that I've seen on the field that I can say out some symptoms and you guys can take guesses what you think is wrong. But that is up to you guys. All right, in that case, if you're going to be there Sunday, I'll have an actual electronics board with some examples to show, and you can see what might lead to something being wrong, and it'll show common things. Otherwise, thank you guys. Sorry, I was a little bit jumpy.